Hi everyone, welcome to the Global Research Network. My name is Bauyrzhan Zhanadilov. I am a junior fellow of the think tank program on alternative dispute resolution. The program focuses on salient issues of arbitration, mediation, and other forms of ADR processes arising regionally or globally to proffer new ideas on the development and promotion of ADR mechanisms as effective methods of resolving international disputes. Under this program, we are launching lots of activities, and one of them is this series of interviews titled My Project, in which scholars and legal practitioners present their ADR-related projects. Our first guest is Dr. Emilia Onyema, the fellow of our think tank program. She is also a professor of international commercial law at SOAS University of London, where she teaches international commercial arbitration and international investment law. She is qualified to practice law in Nigeria and as a solicitor in England and Wales. She is also registered as fellow of Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and she also practices as independent arbitrator. Her research interests focus on the development of international arbitration in Africa and the engagement of Africans in international arbitration. She has an extensive experience as presiding, call and sole arbitrator, and as expert witness in international commercial arbitration. Dr. Onyema, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very, very much for the invitation. Thank you.
You're welcome. So could you please tell us about your project, 2020 Arbitration in Africa? What is your project about, and why did you decide to conduct this survey?
So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for honoring our invitation to this interview. The research and the survey in particular is the second one we're conducting since 2018. So it's meant to be a biannual survey, and the first one was in 2018. So the one we did last year, 2020, was the second one. The idea behind the surveys is to be able to contribute original information from the continent or from those who practice arbitration on the continent to inform international commercial arbitration discourse. And so we don't want anecdotal evidence that we can't support or we can't empirically verify. And so that's the main idea behind the surveys, is to get original data coming from practitioners on the continent and those who work outside of the continent, but relevant to the continent, to share on their own experience and to provide data on what is going on regarding arbitration in Africa.
Okay, great. Yeah. Could you please just remind me, how long have you been conducting this survey?
So this is our second survey. So we started in 2018. So the first one was in 2018.
Okay, so almost 4 years passed, right?
Yeah, twice. Okay, every 2 years. So the next one is going to be in next year in 2022.
Oh, interesting. Okay, let's talk about the methodology. What methods did you use in your survey?
So this particular survey, we had used quantitative methods. We used an online survey, which was open to anybody across the world that had any experience of arbitrating on the continent. And so that way we pulled in, we got responses to the online survey. We had both closed and open questions. And then we also did our own independent research on the website of some of the ones we could find, arbitration centers operating on the continent, so that we can mine information, data, relevant information that they had. And what we then did was when we pulled in the data from the online survey, we also to check the data to be sure that it's not too skewed, because any survey depends on who responds to the survey. And what we then did was the data we had mined from the website of some of these arbitration centers. We then did some coding exercise so that we can, to enable us rank the centers on clearly defined criteria. So that was what we did.
Okay, so so you used first of all, you used is an independent coding analysis, and then also, in addition, to make more objective, you also conducted an online questionnaire, right?
Yes.
Okay, could you please explain a bit more about independent coding analysis? For example, how does it work?
So with the coding, what we did was some really serious basic coding. We identified certain factors, certain criteria. So for example, it was easy for us to know how many arbitrations that the center had conducted.
Okay.
And then how many they had conducted under their own rules, and how many they had conducted as ad hoc or as appointing authority. And then the other factor or element that we coded was the relationships that they had, the memorandum of understanding or association with other arbitration centers in their home country, within Africa and outside of Africa. So we gave a value to each of those, depending on how far removed it is from the business of administering arbitrations. So for example, for each arbitration reference that was administered by the institution under its own rules, we gave a notional value of 1. For each arbitration that was conducted under the rules of another center or ad hoc, we gave a notional value of 0.5. For each MOU that was conducted, that they have with a foreign non-African arbitration center, we gave a notional value of 0.4, and then, down the scale. And so that way we were sure that we were rating all the institutions on the same basis and applying the same criteria. And so we then added up all the valued points, and the one with the highest points came out on top. Well, so we did that as an independent exercise. Then the feedback we got, the responses from those who answered our online survey, basically tallied with what we had done independently. So for example, the top 2 arbitral centers, which is the Arbitration Foundation of Southern Africa and the Cairo Regional Center for International Commercial Arbitration, were basically jostling for first and second. In our own independent coding exercise, AFSA was first, Cairo was second, and then the responses from those who responded to the online survey as well. Cairo was first, AFSA was second, so in some points, and then in other points, AFSA was first, Cairo was second. So that gave us a lot of reassurance that we were feeling our way in the right direction. And what it also meant was it went to the confidence that people could place on the ranking we had done, because whether it is by responses from respondents, it was those top 2, whether it was by our own independent coding, it was the same top 2. And what we now need to improve on, which we recognize in the report, is that we have to have more factors that we would assess each of the centers against. It all depends on what information, data we can find publicly available or we can get from the centers.
Well, that is very complex analysis, I would say. So I have some questions about the respondents, but first let me ask you about the online questionnaire. So what kind of questions did you include in the questionnaire? And could you please provide maybe some examples?
Okay. So part of the questions that we had for the online questionnaire, for example, we asked questions along the lines of, what is your experience? One, do you have any experience of any of the centers, arbitral centers on the continent? And then if you said yes, then which one? And so that's why we used a combination of both open and closed questions. And then we asked how many times, and then we asked where you were located as the respondent to enable us identify where our respondents were coming from. We then also asked for the number of arbitrations to help the respondents have been involved in, to enable us gauge the experience of those responding. And then we asked questions along the lines of whether they have participated in institutional arbitration, and which institution, ad hoc, where, under what rules, if any. We then asked what for them would be the most important facilities that an African arbitral center should possess. So that was an open question that we got lots of responses from. We also asked what was the most difficult or the poorest experience they had. And they gave us, that was an open question, and then we got some responses as well from that. So those were the sorts of questions we asked respondents. We also asked, because we wanted to get a sense of the seats, of African seats. And what we did was, instead of just asking for the countries, we asked for the cities themselves within the continent. And we then identified which country, or which countries entertain or host the most arbitrations on the continent based on the respondents. And what we then found out is that the responses we got also almost tallied with corresponded with where our respondents were coming from. So for example, we had the highest number of respondents were from South Africa. And so we had quite a number of cities from South Africa. And then we also had the next level, the second highest was from Nigeria. And then we had a couple of Nigerian cities as well. But with Nigeria, we didn't have any of the arbitration centers, the major centers, coming up on top. And that we tried to understand why that was the case. And we found out that in Nigeria, the vast majority of arbitrations are ad hoc and not institutional. And so there's it shows that there's some gap, there's need to do some work in that area.
Okay, great. So may I ask you about the language of these questions? Were all the questions in English? Because as far as I remember, Africa is a very diverse region. So there are so many languages.
You're absolutely right. So what we do with our research and the work that we do is our work is produced or published in the 3 major languages. So and you will notice that there's a region that we have a huge gap that we haven't covered yet. So the primary work, the main document we produce in English, because unfortunately that's the only language that I speak. So the main document is produced in English, and the same with our surveys. We then translate those into Arabic and into French. And this in 2020 survey, a law firm in Lisbon kindly translated the report, the survey report, into Portuguese because we're missing that chunk of the continent, the Lusophone area. And so we're hoping with that sort of contact, we're now hoping that our 2022 survey, the plan is to, again, the main document will be in English because that's the language the main team speaks. And then we would then translate into Arabic, into French, and into Portuguese. We're hopeful that that way we would reach many more practitioners and people on the continent. Having said that, I just want to reel out the numbers of the respondents as it relates to language of our 2020 survey. So what we have, so we had it in Arabic, English, and French. And so we had 47 respondents who responded in Arabic. We had 56 who responded in French, and then we had 247 who responded in English. Now, clearly, it doesn't mean that all the people who responded in English only speak English. One of the most beautiful things about the continent is that the vast majority of people speak more than one language. Maybe they speak Arabic, English, and French. I have colleagues who speak Arabic, English, and French. Or maybe they speak French and English, or they speak French and Arabic, or they speak Arabic and English. So I think it creates for greater diversity. So I think it's important that we bear that in mind. It doesn't mean that the vast majority of the continent speaks English. The vast majority of the continent actually speaks French. And so French or Arabic, and that's important. So I'm quite happy that we can now pull in Portuguese into our language bank, and that going forward, our surveys and the reports will also be available in the Portuguese language.
Great. Yes, I absolutely agree with you, because multiple languages allows an opportunity to make your research more deeper. Yeah. So could you please tell me who were the respondents? Because at the very beginning you said that you have a wide target group, right?
Yes. So we try to target anybody that has contact with arbitration in Africa. And so in 2020, last year, yeah. So this particular report, we had respondents who were arbitration practitioners, so lawyers and non-lawyers who either act as counsel in arbitration or as arbitrators or tribunal secretaries. We also had a couple of people who said they had been parties, disputants, which is really, really very interesting, getting their own perspective, because it's quite difficult getting information from disputants themselves. And then we had a couple of experts as well, those who act as experts in arbitration. So those were the different categories of respondents that we had.
Okay, great. So as we talked about the results, so I think, could you please tell us a bit more about the results of the survey? For example, have you identified the most preferred countries, centers, and seats of arbitration in Africa?
Okay, thank you. I think the first thing I'm just going to scan through from the executive summary. So we had 350 responses, which was almost 180 thereabout more than we had for our 2018 responses. And so we then had these 350 responses were from individuals from 34 different countries, from Africa, Asia, Middle East, North America, and Europe. And that was really, really very exciting, because again, it shows that our surveys are not only for the African continent. It tries to get information strictly as it relates to the continent, because that way we can then complement all the other arbitration surveys that are out there. 83%, so 289 of the respondents said they had participated in arbitration in Africa. So we're looking at participation between 2010 and 2019. So that was our reporting period. And 60% of the respondents had participated and had actual experience of institutional arbitration on the continent, while 48% also had of ad hoc arbitration on the continent. And so I already talked about the capacities of the respondents. We had arbitrators, counsel, tribunal secretary, experts, and those who were described themselves as having participated as parties, disputants. And so the top 5 arbitral centers in Africa is the Arbitration Foundation of Southern Africa. And this is from our own independent coding exercise that we did. So the top one was AFSA, then Cairo Regional Center for International Commercial Arbitration. So AFSA is in Southern Africa and Cairo is in Egypt, in North Africa. So it was a good split. And then the third one is Ouagadougou, Arbitration and Mediation and Conciliation Center. And we had OHODA, the Common Court of Justice and Arbitration Center. So 2 Francophone centers. And then we have one from East Africa, which is the Kigali International Arbitration Center, which is doing very interesting work, considering that they only started in 2012. And then the top 5 arbitral centers chosen by the respondents, and this is where the countries where our respondents came from, you'd see the impact. So the top 5 arbitral centers as chosen was, again, Arbitration Foundation of Southern Africa. The vast majority of our respondents were from Southern Africa. Cairo Regional Center, we also had quite a few from respondents from Egypt. Kigali, so Kigali International Arbitration Center, so those 3. And then we had the Lagos Court of Arbitration, because our second most popular country from which our respondents came were Nigerians, and so, or was Nigeria. So the Lagos Court of Arbitration, and then we also had a large response from Kenya, and we have the Nairobi Center for International Arbitration. Now, the problem here with the response is that clearly we had many more from those Anglophone countries. And so all of this, more than from the Francophone countries when we looked at the respondents. So which was why doing the independent coding exercise was really, really very good, because I think that's much more independent than the responses we got from the respondents, but not because of skewing the data. It was simply respondents were asked from their own experience. And if we recognize that Anglophones would generate, so the English-speaking part of the continent would generally participate in arbitrations in other English-speaking parts of the continent. The French-speaking part of the continent, we do the same. Then we begin to understand why we have those slight differences. Then the top arbitral center, so we have an arbitral center that by caseload has actually done many more arbitrations, but it's not an arbitration center. Strictly speaking, the way we defined arbitration center, it is set up as an arbitration center, but it does not have its own arbitration rules. It only administers ad hoc arbitrations. Also under any rules, but as long as it's ad hoc. And so we did not define them as an arbitration center.
So they just provide facilities, right?
Exactly, exactly. So they have the facilities, they have loads of experience in administering ad hoc arbitrations, and that's the International Center for Arbitration and Mediation in Abuja in Nigeria. And then the parties also, we ask them to rank the centers with the best facilities for arbitration. And again, the top 5 were Arbitration Foundation for South Africa, the Cairo Regional Center, the Lagos Court of Arbitration, the Nairobi Center for International Arbitration, and the Ohoda Common Court of Justice and Arbitration. Then the top 5 African cities that host arbitration, we have Johannesburg, Lagos, Cairo, Cape Town, and Durban. So of the 5, 3 are in Southern Africa, okay? And then we are, so the top 5 African countries that act as seats of arbitration is South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Rwanda, and Cote d'Ivoire. And then we then asked if the respondents would recommend, if they have an opportunity to recommend any of the centers for use, would they, and 88% of the respondents said they would recommend those arbitration centers. And so, so very positive, but I think I would also want to note some of the things the respondents had said they found interesting and was good, and those that they thought required some degree of improvement. So for those that our respondents found rewarding, the facilities and the reasons why they would choose African arbitral centers, they talked about expeditious disposal of disputes. I think that will be in the background or in the context of litigating on the continent. And quite a number of African jurisdictions, it takes a long time. Litigation takes time going through the court process. So with that background, if, for example, if you were litigating a dispute and it would take you ordinarily 3-5 years, and you go to arbitration and within 18 months, you're done, you can see, I mean, it's a noticeable difference in time. So people, you know, that was really, really top. It was up there for a lot of the respondents. The second thing was acceptance of the arbitral award by the parties. And this is a funny one. The respondents had talked about how you can conduct an ICC arbitration on the continent, and it will still be as good as if you were in Paris or London or anywhere else without the additional cost. So cost was a major element. Efficiency with the conduct of the arbitral proceedings before the centers, and the fact that the arbitration was localized, that the arbitration was on the continent. I think that was also important. And something about arbitration generally, that it was devoid of unnecessary formality and technicality. The ease with which the parties and the center communicated was helpful. The loads of efficiencies and expediency, use of modern technology. I'll come back to the technology point. Procedural flexibility and the general confidentiality of the process. On the technology point, quite a number of the respondents have talked about human and technical facilities in these centers. They talked about the centers being in accessible locations. So they're in cities that you can easily access. And most of the cities have airports and good transport network. Quite a number of them talked about having panel of experienced arbitrators. I think that's really important. The centers themselves have multilingual staff, so that, for example, you would find in the Arbitration Foundation of Southern Africa, you'd find in Cairo Regional Center, you would find in the CCJ with multilingual staff. And they talked about state-of-the-art technology and modern technical facilities. They talk about digital and physical library, online filing of documents, and having adequate power supply. So anybody who's gone to the continent knows that power supply is a huge problem for quite a number of countries. And so for these centers that most likely are running also on alternative energy sources, for them to have constant power supply to go through the whole day, the whole process, parties clearly appreciated that. And so what was it that they had, that some of the parties had concerns from their own experience? They said attempts to delay the proceedings by respondent counsel. I think that is a common thing. Then they talked about appointing some arbitrators that are not familiar with the substantive subject matter of the dispute, especially for technical disputes. So if it is something to do with energy, or if it is construction or finance, and the arbitrator that had been appointed is not very comfortable or conversant with that, okay. I think the parties had a problem.
Can I ask a question about the panel of arbitrators?
Yes.
Is the panel majority of centers is white or is not so?
Quite a number of the centers have mixed panels. So the vast majority, especially for the top 5, have foreigners and non-Africans. I would describe them as foreigners. So non-Africans and Africans from across the continent. And there's that, what you would find is that a few of those arbitrators would always be replicated in most of those centers. They would have their names or across the board. But there would parties also retain the right and the power to appoint their own arbitrator. I think that's where you would have this sort of problem, or where a national court appoints an arbitrator for the parties. But generally where parties make their own appointment, that might be where this would come from. But for the arbitral centers, they vet those that they put on their panel, and they try to ensure that they put the right, at least they select on paper, the right arbitrator for the dispute. Then they talked about cost of the arbitration. And one of the things to note is that comparatively, if we compare the cost of that we pay to arbitral centers on the continent, it's not as much as what the arbitral centers outside of the continent is paid. As a matter of fact, I just did a paper on cost and exploring that whole idea and asking whether or why arbitrators sitting on the continent should be any less than if they're doing the same type of work and sitting outside of the continent, where they would earn more. Because it's a question of balancing. We need to also appreciate that institutional arbitration is relatively new on the continent. If you take it that the Cairo Regional Center, for example, that started in 1979, is the oldest. I mean, you can't compare that with centers that have been around over a century. And so the key question then becomes for those centers to make themselves attractive, to encourage people to use their services, and yet not price themselves out of the market, but make enough to sustain the centers and for them to be competitive. And so respondents talked about the cost of the arbitration. And then there were things like, again, enforcement of the award, because not every award debtor would accept it. And talked about another point that I'll just quickly pick up is repeated appointments of some arbitrators.
Okay.
So not necessarily before the same center, but it can also be before the same center. And that feeds back into this whole idea of expanding that list, the panel. So the problems we have with lack of diversity and inclusion at the international level replicates itself on the continent, whether it is regionally or domestically. And so it is the more people are known, and the more people's reputation increase and flows up, with greater information flow, then more people can be included on those panels to ensure that we're not appointing the same people over and over
and again, right? Yeah. So I see. So you previously mentioned that your respondents were also experienced in ad hoc arbitration. So I'd like to ask you which type of arbitration is more popular in African region, whether it is institutional or ad hoc.
So from my own experience and research, there isn't a clear-cut answer. I think it all depends on where you are on the continent.
Okay.
What one can say categorically is that ad hoc arbitration has always been there before institutional arbitration. And institutional arbitration is still relatively new on the continent. And it's a question of trust and being able to trust the institutions, to understand what the institutions do, and getting them to be nominated in people's arbitration agreements. But if it is a question of is arbitration accepted on the continent? Yes, it is. But it is primarily ad hoc because that's how it started. And it needs to make that next leap, take that next step to move over to more institutional arbitration.
Okay. So may I ask you about obstacles? Were there any obstacles during your survey that maybe hindered you or your team in doing it?
Yes, very much so. The huge obstacle is access to respondents. When you're doing a survey, you want as many different voices as you possibly can get, because ultimately it is a representative sample. So the more representation you can get, the more legitimacy that the results hopefully would be. And so it's true that in 2018, we had just under 200 respondents. And in 2020, we increased that, we almost doubled that. But that is not enough, because there's still several people who can respond to the survey who either are not aware that the survey is there. So we sort of try to make a loud bang and noise about the survey. And I think more people are getting to know about the survey, especially with the 2020 survey, with the idea of ranking the arbitral centers it's been on LinkedIn. Different people are using the report from the survey, which is really, really encouraging. Because one of the things we think we can do is provide some raw data that researchers can then work with confidently, relying on that data, and they can interpret the data as needed. And so that's the primary goal of the research. It is for us to provide data to the public. We can interpret it, we will interpret it, but other people can also interpret it. And then our interpretation of it would just be as scholars who are using data that is in the public domain. So that for us, the most important thing is getting as many or respondents as we possibly can across the world. One of the feedback we got for our 2020 survey is in unpacking the respondents, that it will be useful to know respondents, who said what from when. So that, for example, if we have respondents from outside of the continent, we may want to give their opinion a greater value than information that we're getting from respondents on the continent. We have not decided how we're going to work with that, or whether we should, because that is on the premise that respondents from outside of the continent would be more forthright and would be more objective. But that is not necessarily so. And so that's something one has to be careful about. We can't predict, we don't know that. And so it's massively important that all our respondents, their responses or their answers are treated equally. And if we're going to distinguish, then the respondents need to be notified. They need to know that it would be distinguished.
Okay, I see. Well, I wish you all the best in attracting more respondents in future, to do a deeper analysis. So let's talk about the future plans. So are you planning to extend the focus of your research, for example, by including the leading arbitration centers to identify whether or not they are more or less popular among African business community, and why? Because you previously mentioned that you made some comparison with arbitration centers in Africa and in Europe.
Yes, that would be very, very interesting. The way we identify the focus of our next surveys, we do have a team, or a team of people that we sort of explore, our colleagues that we work with, that we explore what's the area that the arbitration community would be interested in getting data, relevant data, as it relates to the continent. And there are lots of other surveys. The beautiful thing again is that many more places are also conducting their own surveys and publishing the reports. One of the things that is of great interest would be how people actually nominate and who they nominate, if we can get that kind of information. Because the nature of arbitration is, because it's a private process and the whole thing is private, except I tell you that I've been nominated or I've been appointed, you might not even be aware that I have been appointed. And what that does is that it's possible for someone who's done only 2 arbitrations to give the impression that they've done 1 million arbitrations. There's no way of knowing. And so it will be interesting if we can find out from arbitration lawyers, so anybody who appoints arbitrators, who they've appointed and why. Again, on the continent, because of the question of dispute flight, that you've just talked about, this whole idea of nominating the ICCs and foreign arbitral centers, and not sitting those arbitrations on the continent, or appointing foreign arbitrators. It would be useful to hear from those who work in Africa-related disputes, at least, why they appoint or nominate. One, if they do that; two, evidence that they do that; and three, why they do that. Because it might also go back to question of expertise, and expertise not just in general arbitration, but maybe subject matter expertise. And that would then help us understand where the gaps are and help those who are preparing, arbitrators on the continent sort of know where they need to put their focus and energy into.
Well, that's great. May I ask you one last question before we finish our interview? What can you recommend to young scholars who are planning to do or who have already been doing a survey?
Okay. So I think that the first thing for any scholar, young or old or medium, middle-aged scholar, I think the first thing is to determine the issues. What is it that you're looking for? Because depending on how you frame the question, it might be an answer that you would get in the literature, and it might be an answer that you can mine yourself without having to do a survey. And so lots of institutions, there's lots of data, there's lots of statistics out there that that can help with that interrogation. So if I think that should be the first port of call. If you then cannot find, or you're not satisfied with what you find, then it's how you frame your questions. I think you then need to decide whether you want to use closed questions or open questions. It all depends on the particular questions you're asking and what you're hoping to get out of those. And so the key thing to bear in mind is that you want to add something to the body of knowledge or data that we currently have. If it's been done by somebody else, if you're replicating what they've done, it should be adding more information. There's no point, if the answer is already there, doing additional work without asking a different question or bringing in a different jurisdictional view to the point. And so I think that once you narrow down that, or zero in onto, yes, I want to do an survey, and that is the right way for you to go, I think then you need to think of how you draft your questions, because the way you design your question can lead to what answer you would get. So you, as a researcher, you also have to be honest that you're actually seeking, not that you know the answer and you want a particular answer. You want to get a particular answer. The second thing I think is that to ensure that all the respondents get the same question, because if you give us different questions, we will most likely give you different answers. I think that goes to the validity of the whole research. And then you think of how you collate the responses and how you then interpret, whether you're going to use particular software. If it goes above a certain number, it's helpful to use a particular software. And sometimes you may need support from statisticians and all of those sort of people to help you understand the responses. And then you present the responses that you have received. If you want to interpret, like I said, I think it's important that the raw data is made available, and you can then have your own interpretation, but not to cloud the raw data information with your own interpretation, giving the impression that it can only be this interpretation, which might just not be true.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much for your very useful and helpful advice how to conduct a survey. I would like to say thank you again for this very interesting interview. And I would like to remind our audience that this is the first interview and we'll continue our series, so please stay tuned for the next episodes. And I'd like to ask Dr. Onyema about the conference that you're planning to organize, right?
Yes, we are having, so since 2015, we have an Arbitration in Africa conference, a SOAS Arbitration in Africa conference once a year. But we host it with an arbitration center on the continent. Because one of the goals of the conference series is to promote African arbitration centers and to promote arbitration in those cities. So we basically move from one country to the other. And so we are in our 7th year of the conference series. And this year, 2021, we will be in Casablanca. Okay. But we were hoping we were going to physically be in Casablanca, but with the 3rd wave of COVID-19, we've moved the conference back to an online conference. So the theme of our 2021 conference, which would hold online between the 23rd and the 24th of November this year, is navigating the interests of African states in international arbitration and mediation. And I am very, very happy that the General Council of the African Union would give a keynote speech. And that's Her Excellency Ambassador Dr. Namira Negm. She would give a keynote address. She's an amazing speaker. And so it's going to be online. We will open registration. It's in November, but we'll try and open registration in August. The other good news is that we have a free space for 20 students that they can apply for. They have to write a little essay on why they should be the one to get the space and how it will be useful to them. And they can apply for that. And to then know it's not very expensive for those practitioners who are 5 years plus post-call. It's only $100 and for those who are 5 years and below, less than 5 years post-call, it is $50. And it's going to be 2 days of very, very exciting discussions.
Great. So I would like to encourage our audience to attend this conference, and where they have a chance to ask you more questions if they have. So thank you again, Dr. Onyema, for this interview. I wish you all the best in conducting your further research and surveys. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so very much for the invitation. Yeah. And thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.